So imagine signing a piece of paper that just completely ends 738 years of continuous absolute rule.
Right. It's almost hard to wrap your head around that amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, you don't end it with some dramatic final stand. There's no, there's no guillotine in a public square.
No epic battle on the marble steps of the ancestral palace.
Exactly. You just end nearly 8 centuries of a dynasty with a quiet, carefully worded, essentially bureaucratic memo.
Which is a profoundly modern way to dismantle a millennium of feudalism, if you think about it. Very polite, very administrative, and beneath the surface, completely fraught with the threat of total collapse.
Well, today we're looking at the ghosts of the House of Wittelsbach. Welcome to this deep dive, because you are about to travel to Munich. And, well, because you're going to walk through the echoing corridors of the Munich Residenz and the sprawling gardens of Nymphenburg Palace, we have put together a custom-tailored prep session just for you. We've taken a massive stack of historical texts, architectural surveys, and palace archives to figure out how one single family held on to the reins of power for so long.
And when we say so long, we really need to put that in perspective. 738 years.
It's staggering.
It is. That's an unbroken line stretching from the grit of the High Middle Ages right into the mechanized slaughter of the 20th century.
Yeah.
While the rest of Europe was constantly, violently redrawing its borders.
While entire empires just completely collapsed and royal heads rolled, the Wittelsbachs pretty much just stayed put.
Okay.
Let's unpack this, because immediate question, and the question you should be asking yourself as you walk up to these massive palace gates, is simply how?
It's the big question.
Right. Like, what is the survival mechanism here?
Yeah.
If I look at the history of, say, the English monarchy, it's a constant game of musical chairs.
Oh, for sure. Different houses, usurpers, civil wars.
Yeah. But you're telling me this one family in southern Germany just figured out the cheat code for dynastic immortality?
Well, I wouldn't call it a cheat code, but they did possess a very specific, highly calculated toolkit for survival.
Okay.
It wasn't just about having the biggest army, though they certainly deployed violence when the math favored them.
Naturally.
Their longevity really came down to a mastery of structural mechanics. They utilized complex legal loopholes. They practiced something we can call architectural statecraft.
Architectural statecraft. I like that phrase.
Yeah, literally building their political arguments out of stone and silver to overwhelm their rivals. And most importantly, they had an almost chameleon-like pragmatism.
So they weren't exactly romantic about their loyalties.
Not in the slightest. When the political weather shifted in Europe, the Wittelsbachs didn't brace against the wind, They simply changed their sails.
Right.
They evolved from scrappy medieval warlords to heavy hitters in the Holy Roman Empire to French-style absolute monarchs, and then finally into a sort of modern heritage foundation.
Wow. Okay, so to really understand those glittering palaces you're going to visit, we have to start at the foundation. We have to strip away the Rococo gold leaf, ignore the crystal chandeliers for a moment, and just look at the dirt. We need to go back to the 12th century.
Yeah, if we trace the lineage back, there is a figure named Otto I of Shiren in the 11th century.
Okay.
But the dynasty doesn't truly step onto the main stage of European geopolitics until the year 1180. That is the genesis moment.
So paint that picture for us. What is the geopolitical reality of 1180, and how do they actually get their foot in the door?
So at this time, the overarching superpower in Central Europe is the Holy Roman Empire, led by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa.
Barbarossa, right. Big name.
Huge name. And Barbarossa has a massive internal problem. He has a vassal, a duke named Henry the Lion from the House of Welf.
The Welfs.
Exactly. Henry is immensely powerful. He controls vast territories, and he is chronically rebellious. He essentially refuses to support the emperor in a crucial military campaign in Italy.
So the emperor basically needs to fire his top executive.
Effectively, yes. Barbarossa finally manages to legally depose Henry the Lion, but now he has a vacant duchy. Bavaria. He needs to install someone new, and he needs someone reliable, someone whose power derives directly from the emperor's favor so they remain loyal.
Makes sense.
So he chooses a loyal Count the First of Wittelsbach.
The ultimate promotion.
Exactly. The emperor formally invests Otto with the Duchy of Bavaria. The Wittelsbachs replace the Welfs. And that singular administrative decision initiates a continuous rule that will last until 1918.
It's amazing to think that the entire Bavarian identity you see today basically started because a 12th century emperor needed a reliable middle manager.
Pretty much.
But they didn't just sit on Bavaria, right? They immediately started looking at the map. And there is a geographical concept we need to clarify here because I think a lot of people just picture modern Germany. But the Wittelsbachs ended up controlling two very distinct, separated regions.
Yes, and this is crucial to understanding their entire history. In 1214, through a combination of imperial favor and strategic marriage, they acquired another massive piece of territory.
The Palatine of the Rhine.
The Palatine.
Let's ground that geographically for the listener. Where exactly are we talking about?
Think of it as two highly lucrative toll booths on the highways of medieval Europe. Bavaria is in the deep south, controlling the lucrative Alpine passes into Italy.
Okay, so mountain money.
Right. And the Palatinate is further west, centered around the Rhine River, which is the primary economic artery of Western Europe.
So they have the mountains and they have the river.
Precisely. They aren't just regional southern dukes anymore. They suddenly have a massive power base in the wealthy, densely populated Rhineland.
Wow.
And acquiring this kind of land wasn't always done through warfare. It was often done through incredibly shrewd legal maneuvering.
Which leads us perfectly into my absolute favorite historical anecdote about this family. Okay. This happens around 1204, involving Duke Louis I. Yeah. He's looking to expand, and he sets his sights on Ludmilla of Bohemia. She is a very wealthy widow, and crucially, she has a claim to the highly desirable lands of the Counts of Bogen.
The Bogen lands, yes. Very strategic.
So Louis wants the land, which means he wants to marry her, but Ludmilla is not some naive noblewoman.
No, not at all. The political landscape for a medieval widow was incredibly dangerous. Land was everything.
Right.
The standard operating procedure for an aggressive duke might be to compromise a widow, essentially force an engagement to get control of her estates, and then find a legal loophole to abandon the actual marriage once the ink was dry on the property deeds.
So she knows the game. She knows he might be running a scam. So she sets a trap. She agrees to meet Duke Louis in her private chambers. But before he arrives, she takes 3 of her highest-ranking, most trusted courtiers, and she hides them behind a heavy tapestry in the room.
It's so brilliant.
Then when Louis arrives, she holds up 3 holy pictures paintings of saints, and she tells him, "I will not speak with you further unless you make a solemn vow to marry me right now in front of these 3 witnesses."
And you really have to understand the medieval legal mind here.
Right. Tell me what he's thinking.
Duke Louis is looking around an empty room. He sees Ludmilla, and he sees 3 inanimate paintings. In the feudal legal system, a vow is only binding if it is heard by human witnesses of sufficient rank. You can't be held legally accountable by a painting.
So he thinks he's found the ultimate loophole. He probably thinks she's just being overly pious or maybe just a bit foolish.
Exactly.
So he puffs out his chest, stands in front of these paintings, and boldly swears a sacred oath to marry her. And the absolute second the words leave his mouth, Ludmilla pulls back the tapestry.
And out step 3, living, breathing, high-ranking nobles.
The trap snaps shut.
It snaps completely shut.
They heard every single word. It's literally the 13th century equivalent of a hidden camera sting operation. He is caught dead to rights.
It is a total masterclass in dynastic contract law. She forced his hand, they married, and the alliance was secured. And what's really fascinating is the cultural legacy of that specific union.
Oh, right.
Because through Ludmilla's lineage, the Wittelsbachs inherited the coat of arms of the Counts of Bogen.
Wait, is that the famous blue and white pattern?
It is. The blue and white lozenges or diamonds that you see on the modern Bavarian flag, on every beer garden table, on the logo for BMW, that pattern comes directly from Ludmilla's family.
That is wild.
The Wittelsbachs combined those blue and white diamonds with the golden lion of the Palatinate, creating their iconic visual brand.
That is incredible. The very symbol of Bavaria exists because a clever widow hid her lawyers behind a curtain.
Basically, yes.
But this tells us something deeper about the family's survival, doesn't it? It wasn't just about, divine right. It was about navigating the mechanics of power.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it was entirely about mechanics. But as they gathered more land, Bavaria and the Palatinate, they created a structural problem for themselves.
Right, because feudal inheritance was messy.
Very. When you have 2 massive territories, how do you divide them among your sons without tearing the family apart?
And the answer is usually you do tear the family apart.
Yes. In 1329, the family signed the Treaty of Pavia. This is a foundational document because it formally split the dynasty in 2. You now had the older Palatinate line ruling the lands in the west, and the younger Bavarian line ruling from Munich.
Let me stop you there. Doesn't splitting a dynasty weaken it? I mean, if I'm a rival house, I'm thrilled that the Wittelsbachs just cut their power in half.
In the short term, yes. It bred intense, sometimes violent internal rivalry, but the treaty contained a brilliant insurance policy.
What was it?
They agreed to a pact of mutual inheritance. If the Palatinate line ever died out, meaning no male heirs, their lands would automatically revert to the Bavarian line, and vice versa.
So they basically diversified their portfolio. They created two separate corporate entities, but if one goes bankrupt, the other absorbs the assets.
Exactly. It was a safety net that would save them from total extinction centuries later. But even divided, they were producing major players. The Bavarian line produced a Holy Roman Emperor, Louis IV, who ruled from 1314 to 1347.
Okay.
And he gives us a great window into how the Wittelsbachs viewed traditional authority.
Right, because when you think of a Holy Roman Emperor, you assume they're working hand-in-glove with the Pope. But Louis IV went to war with the papacy.
A massive ideological and political war. At this time, the papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon in France.
The Avignon Papists.
Right. And Pope John the 22nd claimed that he had the ultimate right to approve or reject whoever was elected emperor. Louis IV entirely rejected this.
Of course he did.
He argued that his power came from the electors, from the German princes, not from the Pope.
He essentially told the Pope to stay out of his politics, and the Pope responded by excommunicating him.
Excommunication was a devastating weapon back then. It meant your subjects were theoretically freed from their oaths of loyalty to you.
That's terrifying for a ruler.
It was designed to trigger internal rebellion. The Pope even tried to degrade him by refusing to call him emperor, referring to him insultingly as just Louis the Bavarian.
So how does a Wittelsbach respond to being canceled by the medieval church?
He fought back with intellectual artillery. Louis turned his court in Munich into a sanctuary for radical theologians and philosophers who were fleeing the Pope's wrath. He brought in brilliant, dangerous minds.
Like who? Give us some names.
Most famously, William of Ockham, the English friar known for Occam's razor.
Oh, wow.
He also sheltered Marsilius of Padua. These men wrote blistering philosophical treatises defending the absolute independence of secular rulers from papal interference.
Right in Munich.
Right there. They were laying the intellectual groundwork for the modern secular state, right there in medieval Munich, funded by a Wittelsbach.
So they have this dual power base. They are sheltering radical philosophers. They are fighting popes. They are playing really high-stakes European politics. But having the title on paper is one thing. Surviving the reality of medieval governance is another, because all that external power meant absolutely nothing if they couldn't survive their own citizens.
That is the great irony of their early rule in Munich.
Which brings us directly to the first major site on your itinerary, the Munich Residenz. When you walk up to this complex today, right in the heart of the city, it is overwhelming. We are talking about 130 rooms, 10 massive courtyards.
It's immense.
It is the largest inner-city palace in Germany. It projects absolute untouchable confidence. But it did not start that way at all, did it?
Not even close. It started as a panic room.
I love this transition so much. Explain how this sprawling palace begins as a bunker.
Well, we have to look at the social dynamics of the 14th century. The original seat of the dukes in Munich was a place called the Alterhof, the Old Court.
Right in town.
Right in the center of the town. But Munich was a growing, wealthy, mercantile city. And the citizens, the guilds, the merchants, they did not like being heavily taxed and bossed around by the dukes.
They had leverage, and they weren't afraid to use it.
Right. There were frequent uprisings. The citizens of Munich actually rebelled against Duke Stephen III and his brothers. It was a terrifying experience for the ruling family.
I can imagine.
They realized that living in the center of a dense, highly flammable, hostile city was a terrible security risk. If a riot broke out, they were trapped.
So what do they build?
In 1385, they abandoned the old court and began constructing a new fortress on the extreme northeastern edge of the city. They called it the New Vest, or the New Citadel.
Okay.
It was a classic Gothic moated castle. But its placement tells you everything about their mindset. They built it right up against the city's outer defensive walls.
Why there specifically?
So that if the citizens of Munich revolted again, the dukes could literally open a back door and flee directly into the countryside without having to fight their way through the narrow, angry streets of their own capital.
Wow. The ultimate escape hatch.
Furthermore, they built the strongest, most heavily fortified tower of the castle, the Silver Tower facing inward, toward the city.
Wait, toward the city?
Yes, they were fortifying themselves against their own people.
So when you were standing in the courtyards of the residence today, You have to imagine that original core of fear. It's like a billionaire building an underground doomsday bunker because they are terrified of the masses. But then, as the centuries pass and the dynasty gets stronger, they start spending more time in the bunker. They add a home theater, an art gallery, a new wing, until eventually they just decide to make it their permanent mansion.
That is exactly the architectural progression of the residence. It is a physical timeline tracking their psychological shift from fear to absolute, unchallenged dominance.
From the Nuvest to the residence.
Exactly. Over 400 years, as the Wittelsbachs consolidated their power and disarmed the citizenry, they slowly demolished the old defensive walls of the New West. They didn't need a moat anymore. They needed display spaces.
And the most breathtaking of those display spaces is a room you will definitely walk through. The Antiquarium.
Oh, yes. Built between 1568 and 1571 under Duke Albert V.
For the listener, when you walk into the Antiquarium, look specifically at the architecture before you look at the art. It is a massive, incredibly long vaulted corridor. It is actually the largest Renaissance hall north of the Alps.
The scale is incredible.
The ceiling curves above you, covered entirely in vibrant frescoes. It feels like stepping into a completely different century. But why was this massive tunnel built in the first place?
It was built purely for storage and display. Duke Albert V was obsessed with the Renaissance ideal of classical antiquity. He had purchased a massive collection of ancient Roman and Greek sculptures, busts, and antiquities.
He was a collector.
A voracious one. But the old Gothic rooms of the fortress were too small and too dark to display them. So he ordered his architects to build this magnificent, airy, light-filled hall extending outward from the old fortress.
And there's a political message there too, right?
Absolutely. The architecture itself was a message. By aligning himself with the art of the Caesars, he was subtly claiming that the Wittelsbachs were the natural heirs to classical imperial authority.
It's architectural statecraft again. And later dukes just kept adding on to it.
Yes, his successors added the spectacular ceiling paintings executed by artists like Peter Candid, and they transformed the antiquarium from a quiet sculpture gallery into a grand hall for state banquets and festivals.
Imagine being a visiting diplomat from a minor German state, and you are invited to dinner in the antiquarium. You walk down this endless hall, surrounded by the emperors of Rome under a painted heaven, to sit at the table of the Bavarian duke. The psychological intimidation must have been intense.
Which was entirely the point. And that strategy was escalated significantly by Maximilian I, who ruled from 1597 to 1651. He is the one who built the magnificent West Wing, known as the Maximilian Residence.
Right, if you approach the residence from Max Joseph Platz, you will see this grand facade.
Look at the portals on that facade. They are flanked by massive bronze lions, and right in the center is a towering bronze statue of the Virgin Mary, the patron of Bavaria.
Okay.
Maximilian wasn't just building a house, he was publishing a manifesto in bronze and stone. He created the Kaiserhof, the emperor's courtyard, deep within the complex.
Wait, why call it the emperor's courtyard if he was only a duke?
Because it was designed specifically to host the Holy Roman Emperor should he visit, but it was built on a scale that rivaled the emperor's own palaces in Vienna.
Bold move.
Maximilian was signaling to the entire continent that Bavaria was a premier power, subordinate to almost no one.
And you can't project that kind of power without cold, hard cash. Or, in the case of the residents, cold, hard silver. When you take the tour, you will eventually enter the treasury and the silver chamber. It is mind-boggling.
It's blinding.
There are over 4,000 items of silver and gold tableware. But how does one family accumulate a collection like that? Surely they didn't just buy it all at once.
The history of that silver collection perfectly mirrors the political turbulence of the family. During the 17th century, specifically the 30 Years' War, the Wittelsbachs were heavily involved in the fighting. Wars are expensive.
Right.
So much of the original Munich silver treasure was simply melted down.
They turned their fancy soup tureens into currency to pay mercenaries.
Exactly. The silver you see today is largely the result of later political windfalls. For instance, when the Palatine branch of the family finally reunited with the Bavarian branch in 1777, which we'll discuss in a moment, they brought their own staggering collections of silver from the Rhineland to Munich.
So a massive influx of wealth from the cousins.
And then the real jackpot occurred in 1803. This was the period of secularization.
Okay, explain how that worked. What does secularization mean practically for the Wittelsbach bank accounts?
At the beginning of the 19th century, the political map of Germany was radically reorganized. There were many independent territories ruled by prince-bishops.
Prince-Bishop.
Yes, powerful church officials who were also sovereign rulers, like the Prince-Bishop of Bamberg or Würzburg. During secularization, these ecclesiastical states were dissolved and absorbed into larger secular territories, like Bavaria.
So the Wittelsbachs basically executed a hostile takeover of church lands.
And with the lands came the assets. The Wittelsbachs absorbed the comprehensive, incredibly opulent silver dinner services from those dissolved bishoprics. They carted the treasure of centuries of powerful bishops right into the Munich Residenz.
So when you look at those display cases, you aren't just looking at fancy tableware. You are looking at the melted-down reality of religious warfare, the inheritance of distant cousins, and the spoils of secularizing the church. It is political history rendered in sterling silver.
The residence in its entirety was a machine designed to project unity, wealth, and absolute Catholic dominance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the facade of unity is just that, a facade. While they are projecting this impenetrable, unified front inside the stone walls of Munich, the broader Wittelsbach family network was fundamentally violently tearing itself apart.
Yes. To understand their survival, we have to look at their greatest vulnerability themselves.
We mentioned earlier that the family split into two lines, Bavaria and the Palatine. But that split became a massive political liability thanks to a document called the Golden Bull of 1356. Can you explain what this document was and why it caused such bad blood?
Well, we have to look at how the Holy Roman Empire actually functioned. It was not a hereditary monarchy like England or France, where the crown just passes to the eldest son. The emperor was elected.
Right, by an electoral college.
Precisely. A very small, extremely elite group of prince-electors, 7 of them to be exact. Whoever held one of those 7 votes possessed the most valuable political currency in Europe because candidates for emperor would bribe, cajole, and grant massive favors to secure those votes.
So having an electoral vote is like the ultimate VIP pass.
In 1356, the emperor was Charles IV from the rival House of Luxembourg. He hated the Bavarian Wittelsbachs because their father had fought him. So when Charles issued the Golden Bull, which formalized the rules of the empire, he explicitly stripped the Bavarian branch of the Wittelsbachs of their right to vote.
Oh, the ultimate snub.
He took the single Wittelsbach vote and gave it exclusively to the Palatinate branch of the family.
Imagine the resentment. You are the Duke of Bavaria, sitting in Munich, incredibly wealthy, heavily armed, but your cousins out west get to pick the emperor, and you are just locked out of the room. That alone would cause tension. But then the Reformation happens, and religion pours gasoline on this family rivalry.
The confessional divide is what turned a family grudge into an international catastrophe. During the Reformation, the 2 branches of the family took violently opposing paths.
Tell us about the Bavarian side first.
The Bavarian line in Munich became the militant, uncompromising champions of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. They brought in the Jesuit order, heavily policed religious thought, and aligned themselves deeply with the Catholic Habsburg emperors in Austria.
So they were the sword of the church in southern Germany. What about the cousins in the Palatinate?
The Palatinate line embraced Protestantism, and not just moderate Lutheranism. They adopted Calvinism, which was a much more severe, politically active form of Protestantism.
So let's review the board here. You have 2 branches of the same family. One holds the highly coveted electoral vote, but is Calvinist. The other is fiercely Catholic, deeply wealthy, allied with the emperor, but has no vote. This is a powder keg.
And the spark that ignited it was the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century.
Let's break down the mechanics of how this family feud kicked off one of the deadliest conflicts in European history.
It centers on a young man named Frederick V. He is the head of the Palatinate line, so he is the Protestant elector. In 1619, there was a massive rebellion in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic.
Okay.
The Protestant nobles there overthrow their Catholic Habsburg ruler, and they offer the crown of Bohemia to Frederick.
They basically say, come be our king and help us fight the emperor.
Exactly. Frederick accepts. He moves to Prague and is crowned King of Bohemia. He is stepping directly on the toes of the Holy Roman Emperor.
He is famously known in history as the Winter King. Why is that?
Because his reign lasted exactly 1 winter.
Brutal. What happened?
The Catholic emperor needed an army to crush Frederick. And who did he turn to? He turned to Frederick's own cousin, Duke Maximilian I of Bavaria. the militant Catholic sitting in the Munich Residenz.
The guy who built the emperor's courtyard.
The very same. Maximilian commanded the army of the Catholic League. He marched his highly disciplined troops to Prague, and at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, he absolutely annihilated the forces of his Protestant cousin.
Let's pause and absorb the sheer dysfunction of this. You are commanding artillery and infantry to slaughter the troops of your own blood relative, all over religion and politics. It's like a vicious corporate succession battle. If the rival factions were armed with muskets and pikes, and the prize wasn't the CEO chair, but an electoral vote.
Because that was Maximilian's ultimate goal. He wasn't just helping the emperor out of Catholic piety. He demanded a price.
Of course.
After crushing Frederick, Maximilian forced the emperor to strip Frederick of his lands in the Palatinate, drive him into exile, and most importantly, transfer that coveted electoral vote back to the Bavarian line.
So Maximilian got the VIP pass back to Munich. He weaponized a religious war to settle a 300-year-old family score. But war is chaotic, and eventually the religious fervor cools down. Fast forward 100 years to the early 1700s. The Catholic lines of the family start looking at the map, and they realize a very uncomfortable truth.
They realized that their endless infighting had made them incredibly vulnerable to the real superpower on their border, the Habsburgs of Austria. The Habsburgs were always looking for an excuse to annex Bavarian territory.
So the Wittelsbachs have to pivot again. They have to protect the brand.
In 1724, they orchestrated the Wittelsbacher House Union, the House Union. The Bavarian elector and the Palatine elector signed a treaty to unify the Catholic branches of the family.
A truce?
They agreed to support each other legally, and they even pooled their resources to create a joint defensive army of 30,000 men.
A mutual defense pact against Austria. But the real payoff of this reconciliation, the moment that proves their bizarre, divided structure was actually a brilliant safety net, comes in 1777.
1777 is the year the unthinkable happens. The Bavarian line, the descendants of Maximilian, the line that ruled from Munich for centuries, goes completely extinct. Elector Maximilian III Joseph dies of smallpox, and he leaves no male heir.
If the Wittelsbachs were a normal, single-line dynasty, that would be the end. The state of Bavaria would likely be absorbed by Austria, and the name Wittelsbach would just be a historical footnote.
But remember that old Treaty of Pavia from 1329, the mutual inheritance clause?
The corporate backup plan.
Exactly. Because the Palatinate line still existed out west, their leader, Elector Charles Theodore, legally inherited the Duchy of Bavaria. He packed up his court, moved to Munich, and after 4.5 centuries of division, rivalry, and outright war, the Wittelsbach lands were reunified under one ruler.
It's astonishing. The very structural division that caused them so much grief is the exact legal loophole that saved them from being wiped off the map, which sets the stage perfectly for the next massive era of their survival, because this newly reunified wealthy territory was about to collide with the greatest disruptor of the era, Napoleon Bonaparte. To survive the French Revolution and Napoleon, the Wittelsbachs had to execute what is arguably their most cynical, pragmatic, and brilliant pivot yet.
The transition from the 18th into the 19th century was a meat grinder for traditional European monarchies. The French Revolution had proven that ancient rights and divine claims meant nothing against a mobilized citizen army. By 1799, the reunified Wittelsbach territories were under the control of Elector Maximilian IV Joseph. And crucially, he had appointed a chief minister named Count Maximilian von Montgelas.
Montgelas is a fascinating figure. He is essentially the architect of the modern Bavarian state.
He was a brilliant administrator, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment. He realized that the old medieval structures of the Holy Roman Empire were rotting from the inside.
So Montgelas and the elector look at the geopolitical map. To the east, they have the Austrian Empire, which is desperate to annex Bavaria to buffer themselves against France. To the west, they have Napoleon Bonaparte, who is steamrolling across Europe, destroying ancient kingdoms and rewriting laws. Bavaria is caught directly in the crossfire. What is the play here? How do you survive that?
You survive through calculated betrayal. You abandon the sinking ship.
Wow.
For centuries, the Wittelsbachs had derived their status from the Holy Roman Empire, but Montgelas realizes the empire cannot protect them from Napoleon. So he guides Bavaria to ally with the French.
You just switch sides.
Completely. In 1805, they signed the Treaty of Brno. Bavaria formally aligns its military forces with Napoleon's Grande Armée.
The pragmatism is just breathtaking. They look at the man who represents the destruction of traditional monarchy, they shrug, and they say, if you can't beat him, join him. And let's see what kind of deal we can negotiate. How did their people, or the rest of Germany, react to this?
It was certainly viewed as treasonous by the Austrians and the traditionalists, but from a survival standpoint, it was a masterpiece. When Napoleon defeated the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz, the Wittelsbachs were on the winning side, and the payoff was immense.
What was the reward for their loyalty to Napoleon?
In 1806, Napoleon effectively forces the complete dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. A 1,000-year-old political structure vanishes. But as a reward for his German allies, Napoleon elevates Bavaria from an electorate to a kingdom.
They get the ultimate upgrade. From dukes and electors to absolute kings. Elector Max Joseph becomes King Maximilian, the first Joseph of Bavaria.
And to cement this new geopolitical reality, they executed a classic dynastic maneuver. They sealed the alliance with blood. King Maximilian married his eldest daughter, Princess Augusta, to Eugene de Beauharnais.
Who was Eugene?
Eugene was Napoleon's stepson.
Wait, really? They literally married into the Bonaparte family to secure their new crown.
They did.
It is statecraft via radical adaptability. They shed their 1,000-year loyalty to the empire, the exact moment a better offer came along. And this massive elevation in status, becoming a sovereign kingdom, required a new aesthetic. Which brings us to the second palace on the listener's itinerary, Nymphenburg.
What's fascinating here is that if the residence is a dense, fortified record of medieval and Renaissance power, Nymphenburg is something entirely different. It is light, it is expansive, it is built for pleasure and performance.
It is located just outside the city center. When you arrive, you are struck by the sheer width of the place. It stretches out with these perfectly symmetrical pavilions. It doesn't look like a German castle. It looks like a French ideal.
And that is very deliberate. The core of Nymphenburg was begun earlier in 1664 to celebrate the birth of an heir. But as the family's ambitions grew in the 18th century, especially under Elector Max Emanuel, who actually spent time in exile in France, they brought French-trained architects back to Munich.
Trying to capture that Versailles vibe.
Exactly. Men like Joseph Effner and the landscape designer Dominique Girard, who had trained at Versailles.
So they were explicitly importing the aura of the French court.
Yes. The symmetry, the sweeping gravel paths, the massive water features, it was a calculated cultural performance. They were building a stage set to prove that the Wittelsbachs were on par with the Bourbons of France. They were playing the role of absolute monarchs.
When you are walking through the gardens of Nymphenburg, you have to seek out the Amalienburg. It is a small hunting lodge tucked away in the park, but calling it a hunting lodge is a joke.
It is a masterpiece of European Rococo architecture, designed by François Cuvillier.
Tell us about Cuvillier, because his story is wild.
Cuvillier was originally brought to the Bavarian court as a court dwarf, but the elector recognized his immense artistic talent and sent him to Paris to study architecture. He returned to Munich and designed spaces of unimaginable delicacy and opulence.
When you step into the Hall of Mirrors inside the Amalienburg, it is blinding. Silver stucco work covering every inch of the pale blue walls, reflecting the light from the garden. It is the architectural equivalent of a sugar rush. It represents the absolute peak of their confidence. But as we move into the 19th century, beneath this beautiful facade, a structural rot is setting in.
Exactly. Becoming kings under Napoleon gave them the crown they always wanted. But the 19th century was about to fundamentally alter what a crown actually meant.
Which brings us to the most famous, the most romanticized, and ultimately the most tragic figure in the entire 700-year history of the Wittelsbachs, King Ludwig II, the fairy tale king.
Ludwig II is the ultimate paradox. He embodies the climax of the dynasty's cultural achievement and the nadir of their actual political power. He ascended to the throne in 1864 when he was only 18 years old.
Picture this young man. He is striking, he's deeply romantic, he grew up surrounded by the mythic swan knights painted on the walls of his childhood castles. He believes entirely in the divine absolute right of kings. But what is the harsh political reality of Germany in 1864?
The reality is Otto von Bismarck. The reality is the rise of Prussia as an industrialized, militaristic superpower. The political landscape was no longer about strategic marriages or building pretty hunting lodges. It was about steel, railways, and realpolitik.
Ludwig was entirely unequipped for that world.
Completely. And the crushing blow came in 1871. Following the Franco-Prussian War, the independent German states were forged into a unified German empire dominated entirely by Prussia. Ludwig II, under immense political and financial pressure, grudgingly signed the letter offering the imperial crown to the King of Prussia.
So Bavaria is absorbed into this new empire.
Yes. Ludwig kept his title as King of Bavaria. He kept his palaces, but he lost true sovereign independence. Foreign policy, military command, the real levers of power shifted to Berlin. He was now legally subordinate to the German emperor.
So try to put yourself in Ludwig's psychology. You have been raised to believe you are a god on earth. You live in Nymphenburg and the Residenz, surrounded by the physical evidence of your ancestors' absolute dominance. But your actual job has been reduced to reading budgets and attending municipal ribbon cuttings while Bismarck runs the world. How do you cope with that cognitive dissonance?
Ludwig's coping mechanism was absolute retreat. If the real world refused to let him be a true absolute monarch, he would construct a fantasy world where his authority was unquestioned.
I always think of him as a theater kid who got trapped in a bureaucrat's job. He didn't want to debate agricultural tariffs. He wanted to direct Wagnerian operas.
Which is precisely what he did. He became the greatest patron of the composer Richard Wagner. He brought Wagner to Munich, paid off his massive debts, and funded the staging of his epic mythic operas. But Ludwig's obsession went far beyond music. He began to build.
He started building the castles that everyone knows. Neuschwanstein, perched on a dramatic alpine cliff, which literally inspired the Walt Disney Castle. Linderhof, deeply hidden in a valley, designed as a homage to the absolute monarchy of the French Bourbons. And Herrenchiemsee, a literal replica of the central block of Versailles, built on an island in the middle of a lake.
But we must understand the function of these castles. He wasn't building them for statecraft. He almost never entertained foreign dignitaries there. They were not designed to impress rivals like the Antiquarium was. They were private, heavily engineered theatrical sets.
They were intensely private. He barely wanted his own servants around. At Linderhof, he had a dining table engineered to lower through the floor into the kitchen, be fully set with food, and rise back up, just so he wouldn't have to see a waiter.
He was building a hyper-controlled environment where he could dress up and play the role of the Sun King or the Grail King, far away from the humiliating realities of the Munich Parliament.
But building massive palaces on mountaintops and islands requires a level of engineering that is astronomically expensive. And he wasn't using state tax money for this, right?
No, the Bavarian Parliament wouldn't allow it. He was funding these projects from his privy purse, his personal royal income, and when that ran out, he began borrowing heavily from foreign banks and royalty.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
By the mid-1880s, the king was in colossal, unsustainable debt. Adjusted for modern inflation, we are looking at liabilities well over $250 million. He was threatening to order his ministers to break into banks to get more cash. He was entirely disconnected from financial reality.
And the men actually running the government in Munich, the cabinet ministers, they decide they have to stop him before he bankrupts the royal family completely.
In 1886, they execute what is effectively a bureaucratic coup d'etat. They compile a secret report on the king's eccentricities. They hire a panel of psychiatrists led by Dr. Bernhard von Guden.
Wait, did these doctors ever actually sit down and examine the king?
No. They declared him legally insane and completely unfit to rule based entirely on hearsay, witness statements from servants, and the sheer stale of his debts.
It was a political hit job dressed up as a medical diagnosis.
A government commission traveled to Neuschwanstein, took the king into custody, and formally opposed him. He was transported to Burg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg, essentially under house arrest.
And then, just days later, the great mystery happens.
On the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig and Dr. von Guden went for a walk along the shore of the lake. They told the guards to stay behind. Hours later, in the shallow water near the shore, both men were found dead. Drowned.
What is the consensus on what actually happened? Was it murder?
Yeah.
Suicide?
It remains one of the great historical mysteries. The official state version was suicide, that the Mad King rushed into the water to drown himself, and the doctor died trying to stop him. But Ludwig was a strong swimmer, and the water was only waist deep. Many in Bavaria believed, and still believe, that he was assassinated to prevent him from returning to power, or that he was shot while trying to escape. The truth is likely lost to history.
It is a profoundly tragic end. But there's a massive historical irony here regarding his legacy, because his uncle, Prince Regent Luitpold, takes over. The government gets back to sensible, boring administration. But those castles that ruined Ludwig.
The irony is absolute. His obsessive building projects cost him his throne and his life. Yet today, those exact same castles, Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, are the defining global symbols of Bavaria. They are the primary engines of the state's massive tourism industry. They draw millions of people and generate endless revenue.
The theater kid won in the end. He failed miserably as a 19th century politician, but he achieved immortality as a cultural architect. He gave Bavaria its brand.
He did. But even a powerful cultural brand cannot stop the relentless march of modern history. The dynasty survived Ludwig's eccentricity. They survived the long, stable regency of his uncle. But they could not survive the catastrophe of the 20th century.
Which brings us to the final chapter. We started this deep dive talking about a quiet, bureaucratic memo. Let's explore how the world of the Wittelsbachs finally collapsed in 1918.
The last reigning Wittelsbach was King Ludwig III. He was Luitpold's son. He was the antithesis of the fairy tale king. He was an older, unassuming, very conservative man. He had a deep, genuine interest in modernizing agriculture.
He liked cows more than castles.
Exactly. The people of Munich playfully and sometimes derisively called him the Millebauer, the dairy farmer. He walked around in slightly rumpled suits. His trousers were often too short. He looked like a provincial gentleman, not a divine monarch.
But looking like a harmless farmer doesn't protect you when the world catches fire. World War I erupts. Bavaria, as part of the German Empire, sends hundreds of thousands of men into the meat grinder of the trenches.
And despite his modest demeanor, Ludwig III's government made a fatal political error during the war. They became hyper-imperialistic. They made wild, unrealistic demands for territorial expansion. They demanded that after the war, Bavaria should annex parts of Belgium, specifically the port of Antwerp, so Bavaria could have direct access to the sea.
That is so profoundly out of touch. Your people are starving at home, your young men are being slaughtered by machine guns in France, and the king is drawing imaginary lines on a map to get a seaport for a landlocked Alpine state.
The disconnect between the monarchy and the suffering of the population became an unbridgeable chasm. By November 1918, the German war effort is collapsing. The sailors of the imperial fleet mutiny in the north, and the spark of revolution races down the railway lines to Munich.
A socialist revolution breaks out, led by a journalist and activist named Kurt Eisner.
The atmosphere in Munich on November 7th, 1918 was electric and chaotic. Massive crowds of workers, soldiers who had deserted, and peasants filled the streets. Eisner marched to the military barracks, and the soldiers simply joined him. The royal authority evaporated in an afternoon. There was almost no violence. The police and the army just stopped taking orders from the king.
Imagine being Ludwig III.
Yeah.
Your family has held the city of Munich for 700 years. You built the New West to hide from the citizens. You built the residence to awe them. And now the citizens are just ignoring you? What does he do?
He realizes the game is over. He becomes the first of the German monarchs to lose his throne. That very night, under the cover of darkness, he packs his family into a few cars, drives out of the residence, and flees the city through the fog. He eventually crosses the border and takes refuge in a Nymphenburg Palace near Salzburg in Austria.
And a few days later, on November 12th, the revolutionary government in Munich sends an emissary to Nymphenburg. They need to tie up the legal loose ends. They need him to abdicate.
But this is where the stubbornness of the Wittelsbach legal mind shows up one last time. Ludwig III is presented with a draft of abdication. He refuses to sign it. He absolutely refuses to use the word abdicate, and he refuses to renounce his family's 700-year hereditary claim to the throne.
He won't admit defeat on paper. So what does the document, the Anvererklärung, the Nymphenburg Declaration, actually say?
He dictates a statement that is a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity. He says, essentially, due to the current events, I am no longer in a position to lead the government. Therefore, I release all civil servants, all military officers, and all soldiers from their personal oath of loyalty to me, so they may continue to serve the state.
That is incredible. He doesn't resign as king. He just issues an HR memo releasing his employees from their non-compete clauses.
Oh.
I can't pay you right now, so you're free to seek other employment.
It is exactly that. But Kurt Eisner back in Munich is a brilliant propagandist. He receives this ambiguous declaration and he publishes it immediately. But he attaches his own official postscript.
Eisner spins it.
Completely. Eisner publicly declares that the new People's State of Bavaria interprets this document as a formal abdication. He announces, the Wittelsbach dynasty is deposed. Bavaria is a republic. Eisner forced the interpretation. He took Ludwig's stubbornness and converted it into a legal end to the monarchy.
And what's truly remarkable about this moment is the lack of bloodshed.
It is unique in the era. Look at what was happening in Russia in 1918 with the Romanovs. They were brutally executed in a basement. But Eisner publicly stated that the royal family was not in physical danger. He said they were welcome to return to Bavaria and live as normal private citizens, provided they didn't try to overthrow the republic.
The socialist revolutionaries achieved a total regime change without a guillotine. Now, just to be clear for the listener, we are reporting on the facts of this revolution as laid out in the historical texts. We aren't endorsing the royalist claims or the revolutionary actions, but looking at the mechanics, there is a massive, incredibly complicated hangover to this revolution. You can declare a republic, you can release the civil servants, but you have a 700-year backlog of property to sort out.
Yes, the financial untangling.
Because for 7 centuries, there was no difference between the king's personal bank account and the state's bank account. They owned the forests, the lakes, the castles, the art. When the king becomes a private citizen who owns the Munich Residenz, who owns the billion-dollar art collection,
that question triggered years of intense, highly complex legal negotiation between the new democratic state and the deposed royal family. The negotiations culminated in 1923 with the creation of an entirely unique legal entity, the Wittelsbacher Ausgleichsfonds, or the Wittelsbach Compensation Fund.
This sounds like a massive corporate severance package. How did they divide the assets?
It was an incredibly pragmatic compromise. The Free State of Bavaria took absolute ownership of the major political and cultural landmarks. The state got the Munich Residenz, they got Nymphenburg Palace, and crucially, they got Ludwig II's fantasy castles, which were already generating massive tourist revenue.
The state gets the real estate that defines the national identity. What does the family get to keep?
The family retained private, unencumbered ownership of several smaller estates and castles. But the core of the deal was the foundation itself. The family transferred vast assets into this public trust, including over 11,000 hectares of valuable forest and agricultural land, several castles like Hohenschwangau, and their immensely valuable world-class art collections assembled before 1800.
And what is the catch for the family?
The catch was public access. The family agreed that these priceless art collections would remain permanently on display in state museums like the Alte Pinakothek in Munich for the public to view. In exchange, they waived any further financial claims against the state. The foundation manages the lands and the assets, and it pays an annual tax-free dividend to the descendants of the Wittelsbach family.
It is the ultimate golden parachute. They surrender political power, but they negotiate a settlement that leaves their heritage entirely intact and makes them incredibly wealthy private citizens. It is a highly civilized, shockingly effective end to a dynasty.
From medieval warlords hiding behind a curtain to modern executives of a massive heritage trust.
So let's bring this all together for you. When you finally arrive in Munich and you walk through the echoing, vaulted ceiling of the antiquarium in the residence, when you look out over the grand, sweeping gravel paths of Nymphenburg Palace, when you see those blue and white diamonds everywhere, I want you to remember what you are actually looking at.
Exactly.
You aren't just looking at pretty architecture or a nice collection of silver plates or an eccentric king's obsession with Wagner. You are walking through the physical timeline of a family's relentless 700-year survival strategy. You are seeing the melted-down spoils of brutal religious warfare. You are seeing the brilliant, cynical pragmatism of allying with Napoleon to secure a crown, and you are seeing the tragic pursuit of fantasy by a king who built fairy tale castles as his real power slipped through his fingers. From Otto I in 1180 to the quiet bureaucratic finality of the Anif Declaration in 1918, every stone in those palaces is a testament to the Wittelsbach's absolute refusal to be erased from the map.
And as you wander those halls, I'd offer one final thought for you to ponder. The Wittelsbachs spent 7 centuries defining their entire genetic, cultural, and psychological identity by the singular act of ruling. Their only purpose was to project power. So what happens to a family when there is suddenly nothing left to rule?
That is the big question.
If you strip away the political power, the crowns, the electoral votes, and the armies, does the dynasty simply vanish into the history books? Or, by negotiating that 1923 settlement, by permanently opening their art to the public, and by leaving behind the very castles that now define the modern idea of Bavaria, do they achieve a new kind of immortality? Perhaps they didn't fade away at all. Perhaps they simply adapted one last time, evolving into the permanent living curators of their own history.
It is a history that isn't a clean break. It's messy, it's brilliant, and it's deeply human. Enjoy the complex reality behind the gold leaf. Have a fantastic deep dive into those palaces and have an amazing trip.